I know what I said, but I need the money. All right, so when I was a wee lad, I was a pretty big casual Godzilla fan. And I say big casual because despite me having like all of the toys, I have no core memories of the old movies. Well, except for that Roland Emmerich abomination, but we don't talk about that one. The promo merch was top tier though. I will say that. So, due to a number of different health issues, I wound up taking the rest of the year off originally from both this and my day job. And during that time, I went on sort of a kaiju movie mini binge. For what reason, I don't really know. Maybe I was subconsciously preparing myself to see King Kong and Godzilla DP Cranky Kong's crackhead cousin next year. But my point is, I kind of know what to expect from these movies. A dude in a 200-pound rubber suit or a CGI monstrosity rampaging through downtown Tokyo, or shooting phase with any number of other rubber puppets, or a combination of those two things. What I did not expect, though, was a well crafted and pretty emotional narrative centered around complex human characters wrestling with very real world issues like survivor's guilt, post traumatic stress, and wartime Japan's complete disregard for the lives of its people that the Japanese government excused by exploiting traditional cultural values as the basis of its state propaganda. And see, it's that last part that made me want to make this video, because every review of Minus One that I've watched missed that part completely. Some, I think, on purpose even. Okay, so full disclosure, I was only able to get through like 5 minutes of it without checking myself into the ER for fear of having a brain bleed. But one review I watched opened up the video by simultaneously throwing shade at Hollywood while praising Minus One for its lack of, quote, forced diversity and wokeness, which, I mean, Jesus freaking Christ, dude. Okay, so for the moment, let's just completely ignore the fact that we're talking about a period piece set in occupation era Japan, which even today is one of the most ethnically homogeneous states in the world. So why would you even think that? Jesus freaking Christ, man. That aside, to praise Godzilla, specifically either of the two Reiwa movies for their lack of wokeness, is not only one of the most stupid takes I've heard since the last time I watched First Take, but is a prime example of a particular subset of cishet white dudes' stubborn insistence on the shallowest form of media analysis for no real reason than the preservation of their own fragile sense of place in an ever diversifying social landscape. God, y'all are pathetic. That said, I wanted to give my take on this film outside of, again, that particular subset of cishet white men's desire to use it as a gotcha against the creatively bankrupt and woke hive mind that apparently is modern Hollywood, specifically Disney, and even more specifically the MCU. Because, yeah, evidently Marvel is the only Hollywood studio producing movies in the last 12 months. God, y'all are pathetic. Anyway, I want to give this movie the flowers it deserves, is my point, because of how woke it actually is, but more importantly, because of how painfully, even beautifully human it is. And how in its wokeness and in its humanity, Yamazaki returns Godzilla to his post-war roots and messaging. Okay, so if you've made it this far, and I'm assuming that you already know that the Godzilla character and movie was inspired by the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by atomic bombs and the resulting nuclear fallout from those weapons. Well, partly. Because you see, there's another not as well-known inspiration, at least not to us Americans, that in my opinion might have a more direct influence on Godzilla than the war did. that being the Lucky Dragon 5 incident. For those who don't know, Lucky Dragon 5 was a Japanese fishing vessel that encountered the nuclear fallout of the U.S. Castle Bravo thermonuclear detonation, which took place in March of 1954 near Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. So yeah, Godzilla, when he isn't destroying lives and public infrastructure, he's probably jellyfishing with SpongeBob, or more likely he's copping zoinkies from that one headlight fish in Rock Bottom. Anyway, the boat was fishing just outside of the predetermined danger zone that the US had given to the Japanese. However, the yield from the Castle Bravo test was twice as large as predicted, and as a result, the fishing vessel and its 23-man crew was set upon by a cloud of radioactive dust, which the sailors later called death ash. Upon their return voyage the next day, the crew began to experience symptoms of radiation poisoning, beginning with dizziness, headaches, nausea, and diarrhea, which wound up progressing into blisters forming on their skin by the third day of the journey, and hair loss a week into that journey. One of the crewmen kept a bag of the contaminated ash to be examined by experts when they arrived home. And when they did arrive home, experts at Tokyo University determined that the ash was indeed the product of a nuclear bomb. All but one of the crewmen did survive, and the one crewman who did die, his widow was eventually compensated by the US government after a bit of poking and arm wringing from the Japanese, but that's not even the interesting part here. The US, in its attempts to keep their extracurriculars a secret from the rest of the world, but specifically the Soviets, did not send help or even information on how to treat the poisoning, despite several letters sent by, and I'm going to butcher this name, so bear with me, Nishiwaki Yasushi, a Japanese biophysicist who examined the crew. Instead, the Americans sent two medical scientists to basically be the camera crew in a Nat Geo special, which rightfully pissed off the Japanese public when they got the full tea, but not the government so much. At least one crewman accused Japanese officials of kowtowing to the Americans, insisting that they needed to be present during the treatment, despite what turned out to be well-founded suspicion and resentment of Americans in light of Hiroshima and Nagasaki still being fresh in the minds of Japanese citizens, but again, because they never really offered any help to the Japanese in this instance. Despite the Soviets having yet to detonate an H-bomb by 1954, the U.S. denied responsibility for the incident several times, in fact, and even refused to at least disclose the bomb's composition for fear that, again, the Soviets would get a hold of that information and detonate their own bomb. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to substantiate this last point, so take it with a grain of salt. Or not, because I mean America after all, but it is reported that the Americans expanded the danger zone at the last minute, and as a result, at least 100 other ships in addition to Lucky Dragon 5 were contaminated. Again, take this with a slightly raised eyebrow, but the FDA did place a bunch of restrictions on tuna exports almost immediately after the incident. So yeah, America. Again, the Americans did eventually wind up paying a paltry sum in reparations to the Japanese government, the fishermen and their families, and the fishery that they worked for. But the damage was already done. The bomb symbolizes for Japan what 9/11 does for Americans, only much, much worse. Like 10 times worse, in fact, at least based on the casualty count. To this day, the anxiety that the Japanese harbor toward nuclear power can be seen in the public response to things like the Fukushima incident, which itself was a primary inspiration for 2016's Shin Godzilla. Tens of thousands of people evacuated Fukushima Prefecture before anyone even really knew what was going on at the plant there. And even 10 years later, former residents of the region still refuse to go back home, despite it being safe to do so for years now. As a result, Fukushima, compared to other parts of Japan, is plagued by elevated levels of unemployment and, of course, all of its club-footed offspring. And children born in that region are, quote, shunned and stigmatized when they do travel to other parts of the country. All right, so originally I was just going to put this bit of information in a postscript text, but I know a lot of y'all probably don't read that anyway, but I really need y'all to take in this information in order to really at least try to grasp the toll that the bombs took on the collective Japanese psyche. See, nobody actually died from acute radiation poisoning during the Fukushima incident. And there's really no real way to tell how many, if any, will die from long-term radiation side effects. Matter of fact, somewhere between 30 and 50 people died in the actual evacuation process. The real disaster was the earthquake and the ensuing tsunami that caused the plant to blow up in the first place. This claimed somewhere between 15 and 20,000 lives, but again, Japan is used to earthquakes and the ensuing tsunami. But those are natural disasters. Nuclear power, not exactly, bucko. My point is, even possessing a cursory knowledge of 20th century Japan makes it just about impossible to look at -1 and not see the bomb. But perhaps more poignantly, the makers of the bomb. One thing I never thought about until I started writing this script is that the events of Godzilla never really take place during the war, at least when I can think, but sometime afterward. It's also interesting that Godzilla, unlike in most of the movies, actually does die at the end of the original 1954 film, but with a warning from one of the primary characters that so long as nuclear testing persists, another Godzilla can and will rise to continue the terror that the first one began. There's no way that you don't draw a direct parallel between this and Castle Bravo, but the references don't stop there. Again, if you've never seen the original film, which -1 pays a ton of homages to, it begins with a shot of what else but a fishing boat, before the crew is startled by a flash of light bubbling just beneath the ocean's surface, before that same ship is ultimately engulfed by what can only be described as a detonation, before we're then left with a sight of a single ship set ablaze somewhere in the Pacific. Perhaps not so coincidentally, in -1, the telltale sign of Godzilla's presence is the draught of dead deep-sea fish that rise to the ocean's surface, remnant of the after effects of a seaborne weapons test. The final piece of evidence I want to present is the fact that the bombs in real history never reached Tokyo, or at least the atomic ones didn't. Operation Meeting House was a series of U.S. air raids on Tokyo that took place between March 9th and 10th of 1945, 4 months before the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's estimated that anywhere between 80 and 100,000 civilians died in those raids, and at least 1 million more were left homeless. This is the Tokyo that -1 takes place in, one that when we first see it has already been destroyed and decimated before Godzilla has even made landfall. The other thing I thought about is the fact that for as much attention as we give to Godzilla for his literal nuclear power, that part of his arsenal is used sparingly in the movies. I counted 2 times in -1 where he actually got to unload his laser. But more importantly, the heat ray is almost always used thematically at the climax of his rampage. Kind of like somebody else we know. And that's where I want to stop for a second, because I do want to go back to Ishiro Honda's film. I never watched the original Godzilla movie until after I binged the MonsterVerse ones, and I had always known that the OG film was always meant to be taken a lot more seriously than Legendary's Kaiju Fortnite films. But man, if this thing wasn't uncomfortable to sit through, The big knock on Godzilla films, aside from whatever this abomination was supposed to be, was always been the human characters. But the thing is, at least in the OG film, that wasn't the case. The movie spends a ton of time focusing on the human toll of Godzilla's destruction, even showing dead bodies at points. Like, you don't see that in these movies. Not even in Shin Godzilla, as far as I can remember, which is, in my opinion, the most disturbing Godzilla movie that I've ever watched. Like, that's the thing about monsters movies. Yeah, we see the destruction. Matter of fact, that's the whole point. To watch a hyper-realistic Reptar ripoff tear a city to shreds. But I don't know, man. Even as a kid, I couldn't help but think to myself, are there not people in those buildings, man? It's the same thing I thought when I watched Man of Steel and the first two Avengers movies. And it always bothered me that nobody ever really acknowledged the fact that somebody lives in that joint. Well, Honda did, and does confront the human toll of man's hubris. Because that's the thing, Godzilla is not really a malicious monster, at least most of the time he's not. He's a victim of forces beyond his immediate control. Like the bomb, man made Godzilla, and ultimately the destruction he causes is really our own creation. This is most apparent in the design of, again, Shin Godzilla, who is, like I said, the most disheartening and tragic one to date, for me at least. Unlike his CGI peers in the MonsterVerse and -1, Shin Godzilla doesn't have the same toothy scowl and perpetually furrowed brow. When we first see him, he's honestly kinda goofy looking, to the point that honestly it makes him disturbing, with his googly, agape fish eyes and wide open mouth. He moves kind of awkwardly and aimlessly, and even vomits blood from his gills at one point. Nothing about this creature tells me he's angry or even agitated. Rather, it tells me he's in pain. This isn't an analysis of Shin Godzilla specifically, so I'll spare dwelling too much on details, but when you watch his behavior and his almost immediate adaptation to the threats around him, coupled with the somber score of the film, especially during the destruction of Tokyo, this creature isn't one for the audience to fear necessarily. Well, I mean it is, but it's also a creature to be pitied. It's scared, it's confused, it had literally not been able to process what is happening to its body, let alone the response of the people around it. You ever stub your toe or twist your ankle and you then try to just walk it off? Or you ever had a migraine or an upset stomach and you either rolled around on the ground or walked from end to end of the room and back just waiting to throw the pain up? That's kind of what Shin Godzilla is doing, if you ask me. I'll even go a step further and say the way that this monster wanders aimlessly through the city reminds me of when my wife had been intubated less than a year into our marriage. I was scared. I was confused. I literally could not process what was happening, let alone all of the different questions I was being asked by the people around me in that moment. So I wandered. I wandered aimlessly in the waiting room, through the corridors of the hospital, and even around the hospital campus in search of nothing in particular. I just wanted the discomfort to go away, and somewhere in the reptilian portion of my brain, I guess I thought that maybe if I wandered far enough I could outrun the pain. That's what I see when I look at the Shin monster, a creature with no answer to its condition other than to run until things get better. Conversely, the actions of the Honda and -1 Godzillas appear to be deliberate, but again, not necessarily from malice. He's angry. He's lashing out against humanity for forcing this state upon him. In fact, there's an argument to be made that Godzilla could serve as a metaphor for the rage of the Japanese people against both their government and the US for how flippantly the human cost of war was treated by both sides, especially the civilian cost. Now, again, it'll take some Simone Biles level of mental gymnastics to get me to settle on that when the parallel to the Americans is right freaking there. One key element of Japanese culture I don't think is considered often enough with these films is societal shame. It's a constant theme throughout the movie, and one that pervaded Japan immediately following the war. Not just for the surrender, but because of the many atrocities that the Japanese military committed against those on the mainland. And they still lost. Now, I'm not going to go into detail into it, but it was so bad that the Nanking massacre, until recently, like within, I don't know, maybe the past 20 years or so, was popularly known as the rape of Nanking. And as disturbing as that imagery is, it still does not do anywhere near justice to just how horrific the things that took place there and then were. Matter of fact, a dude named John Raby, whatever, he's a Nazi. I don't care. Yes, an actual honest-to-God car-carrying Die Fuhrer was so appalled by what he saw that he sheltered approximately 250,000 Chinese citizens from the cruelties of the Japanese military in direct defiance of his superiors back in Germany. Again, when Nazis say that you're tweaking, then you know you pretty much have gone off the deep end, bucko. But seriously though, even today, a lot of Japanese have trouble acknowledging, let alone reconciling, the atrocities committed against its neighbors on the mainland. You can imagine what it was like back when Japan was still a military state. On top of this, the Allies basically said, F all that noise. If you want our money, our tech, and most importantly, us to stop bombing the crap out of your houses, you'll let us call the shots from now on. Oh, and also we're going to just let our soldiers chill out here for the next 7 years and keep 2 of your islands as military bases forever. Point I'm getting at is America was the sleeping giant that Japan effed around and found out about. And the cost was literally everything, including their sovereignty. Thus the -1 moniker. But the most screwed up part about it all is the majority of Japanese citizens ain't even want the smoke to begin with. All right, so before I really dive into the meat of this section, I want to shout out Gaijin Goomba. Yeah, I bet that wasn't a name y'all thought y'all'd hear on this channel, if you even know who that is. But his review on -1 is really the only one that I've seen that gives proper historical context to the messaging of the film. And when you do know that context, it makes the themes that much more affecting. Again, I'm not going to get into too much detail because, again, Gaijin's video is right there and I'll leave a link in the description. But the Cliff Notes version is because most of us in the West weren't taught really anything about Japan outside of the war, because, I mean, it doesn't count as history unless the US or Europe is involved. Duh, genius. We just accept the common mythology that Japan in 1941 was still very much the warrior cult society that it was during the shogunate. But it wasn't. Between the Meiji restoration of imperial power and the Taisho period of the 1920s and late 1910s, Japan underwent rapid, and I mean rapid, westernization of its economy, its government, and most importantly for our story, its people, or at least everyone outside of the warrior class. See, that's the thing. The average Japanese Joe and Jane actually liked the West. They liked Western goods. They liked Western culture. They liked Western political ideas like representative democracy, which is why they pretty much abandoned their centuries-old feudal system to install one before the 20th century came full swing. For all the Demon Slayer fans like myself in the audience, this right here takes place like 25 years before the bombs were dropped. Matter of fact, Japan even had their own version of flappers in the 1920s. And Michael Jackson. My point is that most Japanese citizens really ain't want to throw hands with the West. That's the catch, man. Most didn't. But the samurai class did. The gift and the curse of the Tokugawa period is when Japan was unified now. Aside from the occasional excursion into the mainland, there really wasn't any purpose for the samurai anymore, which is why a bunch of them just became government bureaucrats, or they basically became Kenshin Himura, or more accurately, most of them became shishio. Yeah, y'all wasn't outside in the early aughts, or inside in this case, whatever. My point is, the samurai lost practically all their influence by the end of the Tokugawa period, which is why the Meiji government disbanded them in 1868, and any who didn't comply got a first-hand demonstration of newly adopted Western artillery, as shown in the award-winning Nat Geo documentary The Last Samurai. I am not joking. The warrior class grew resentful and suspicious of any and everything Western, regardless of how objectively better off the country was, because, I mean, this is usually what happens when the ruling class suddenly finds the tables turned and they're effectively being replaced on the social hierarchy by a class of folk they were taught are inferior to them. I'm not even joking. For real this time. Anyway, many of the powerful military families basically funneled their kids into the military because, as far as they were concerned, once this infatuation with all things of the West was over, the military would be the only field with any good jobs left. But that's not what happened, or at least it didn't happen naturally. The right-wing military extremist portion of Japanese society basically reclaimed control of the Japanese zeitgeist by intimidating, coercing, or straight up killing any opposition until they were the only ones left to or willing to rule. So yeah, it was basically get down or lay down in post-Taisho Japan. And that's the distinction I want to make between the Japanese and the Germans. Again, because we don't really learn anything about Japan's role in the wars until Pearl Harbor. A lot of people like me just assumed that Tojo was Japan's Hitler, especially in light of the, again, many atrocities committed by the military on the mainland. Japan was on the Allied side during the First World War, which is a big reason why they just exerted more and more influence over mainland Asia without any Western powers bothering to check them, because I mean, to the homies go the spoils and all of that or whatever. Germany, however, got basically railroaded by the Treaty of Versailles, which is why by the time the Depression was in full global swing, the Germans were looking for both a savior and an enemy within arm's reach that they could blame for their condition. I'm not even joking. Doubly serious this time. That's what I'm getting at. Hitler didn't need to force anybody to be a Nazi. The ultra-nationalism and bigotry that defined Nazism was already popular enough among the populace that Hitler was basically just the culmination of and the mouthpiece for the German zeitgeist during that time. I am not tired of this bit. Now listen, I don't want this to come off as Japan apologetics or imply that there wasn't a large chunk of Japanese people 10 toes down into BS. I mean, the same industrialization that westernized many Japanese also stoked Japanese nationalism, and the commonly held racism against mainland Asians is the main reason why things like the Nanking Massacre could even be justified by the military to its populace. But you got to understand, Japan's right wing did everything in their power, including, again, straight up murking dudes in broad day, to fragment and ultimately crush the communist, socialist, and basically any left wing groups in the country. And they succeeded. The same underground group serving as de facto secret police for the ultra-nationalist right wing recruited local leaders like Shinto priests, mayors, bada bada, etc. and whatnot to spread their propaganda to the populace. This wound up culminating in a series of failed coup attempts to install a military dictatorship that led to the League of Blood incident and the public trial of its co-conspirators. The details of the incident itself aren't really important for the purpose of this video, but what is that this trial gave the ultra-nationalists the platform they needed to espouse their views, specifically their desire to, wink wink, restore power back to the emperor. And thus they wound up garnering sympathy from a reeling public in light of the ongoing economic turmoil, while Japan was still figuring out the whole democracy thing. After that, the writing was basically on the wall, as Japan's PM was assassinated later that same year, and the country was effectively a military state until the end of World War II. Again, I'm not saying that the Japanese people weren't into some BS, but what I am saying is that the BS they were into had nothing to do with the West until Tojo. See, on top of getting their behinds handed to them by the Russians and the Chinese, the US, the British, and the Dutch wound up placing an embargo on Japan because of their incursions into the mainland, which ironically enough now meant that Japan had to win in China because they didn't have any other means of getting the petroleum they needed to keep the war machine running. So the absolute last thing the Japanese could afford at this point was an all-out war with the Americans on the other coast.
Now you see now, you done fucked up, you know that, don't you?
Okay, so there's no real one answer why Tojo insisted on attacking the US. The embargo thing was part of it, as well as they needing to buy time to do whatever they needed to do in the South Pacific before the Americans showed up. And then there's also like 100 or so years worth of bad blood between the Japanese and the Americans leading up to the war that I kind of glossed over earlier. But the point is, whether it was hubris, stupidity, or whatever, or some combination of those things, Tojo grossly underestimated the Americans' own ultra-nationalism. And once Japan realized that America was not the slovenly sloth bear they thought it was, well, we're boned. What I'm saying is Japan knew they were screwed the minute FDR went to Congress. So the only real way to get out of Dodge while still saving face at this point was to break the Americans' resolve and or turn public opinion back home against the war. So yeah, literally the Tet Offensive, but like 20 years earlier and not nearly as successful. And this is where the movie comes in. I really didn't mean for this to turn into a crash course on turn of the century Japanese geopolitics, but it all serves to get to this point. Japan effectively being ruled by the grandchildren of the last samurai meant that those grandchildren expected even the conscripted soldiers to act according to Bushido, which for y'all that remember says that there is nothing more glorious than to die in service to your Lord. Lord in this instance being the totalitarian military regime of General Tojo. Matter of fact, the most chilling thing I learned from Gaijin's video is that while their husbands were out fighting the Americans on some remote island in the South Pacific, Japanese housewives were being taught by the military to fight off invaders with sharpened bamboo sticks. The message was loud and clear from jump is what I'm saying. The expectation was not for the military to serve the people, but for the people to serve the military. Even, matter of fact, especially if it cost their life. And now we can finally get back to the movie. Again, I'm going to keep spoilers to a minimum here, but the movie is set around the arc of Shikishima, a failed Japanese kamikaze pilot who spends the length of the movie's run trying to process his grief and survivor's guilt in the midst of he and his countrymen navigating the new threat that is Godzilla. Again, in the context of the ultranationalism and revived warrior cult ideology that Japan was experiencing, Shikishima's actions are as taboo as they come, especially considering the role that shame plays again in Japanese culture. You just did not submit if you were Japanese. You fought, and you fought ferociously to your dying breath. So the absolute worst thing you could do as a Japanese soldier during World War II was puss out, which is exactly what Shikishima did. And now he's forced to live with not only the socially sanctioned shame of being a coward, but the guilt of watching his countrymen die because of his cowardice. Shikishima encounters Godzilla for the first time on Odo Island, and when given the choice between most likely having to offer his life in exchange for his countrymen or pussing out again, he chooses self-preservation. Except this time he's forced to watch in horror the consequences of his decision, something that literally haunts him for the rest of the movie. I'm not going to explain to y'all what survivor's guilt is because duh, but what I think I appreciate the most about the way it's handled here is how the two primary human characters in this film represent different ways of experiencing it. Shikishima struggles to process how fate chose him to let him live over countless more deserving others, despite he and most of the people around him believing that he's not worthy of that grace. On the other hand, Noriko chooses to live on purpose in honor of the people who lost their lives in order for her to continue living. Neither is at all an easy task, but this is part of why I always thought the whole people who unalive themselves are cowards thing is so freaking stupid. Like, I've never contemplated it myself, but I do know that attempts to do so literally go against human biology. Everything in us is hardwired for self-preservation. So to attempt such an act takes either a tremendous amount of either courage, despair, or both. Now, understand, I'm not by any means commending or encouraging self-unaliving, and if there is anybody watching who is contemplating such, I implore you to just go get something to eat, take a nap, and give it at least one more day. Or if it is emergent, call the phone number appearing on your screen now. Like, I am so deadly serious right now. But what I am saying is Shikishima's apparent cowardice in the face of an assured demise is literally the most human response a person could have in that situation, and is not at all anything to be ashamed of. Something that he's reminded of at least twice before the movie ends. Still, as a survivor of communal trauma myself, I can co-sign the fact that no matter how much you live and live on purpose, there's always a piece of you stuck where it all happened. And maybe that's the reason why so many survivors feel not just a sense of guilt, but one of duty to the people who made their life possible, even and perhaps especially after those people are already gone up yonder. It's a way of making sense of a senseless situation. It's in our nature to try and find meaning in even the most innocuous of happenings. So something as cataclysmic as an actual freaking war, we gotta find a way to make it make sense for ourselves, especially if we played a direct role in it. I think one of the most poignant lines of the film is when Shikishima says twice that my war is not over. It's a sentiment harbored not only by Shikishima, but others who fought in the war. It's also something you hear a lot of vets say, specifically the ones who served in operations in which they either did not have a definitive victor or they came out on the losing side. It reminds me a lot, honestly, of Colonel Nick Fury, the evil version in Kong Skull Island. He's obsessed with getting the lick that his superiors robbed him the chance of ever getting back in Vietnam. As cartoonishly villainous as he is, that aspect of his character makes him, in my opinion, the most human of them all, even sympathetic. He never got a chance to make things right, to make all the sacrifice of years of effort, of blood, of men worth it all in the end. And he feels, to some extent, I guess, that he owes it to those men to get that lick back by any means necessary. And I guess any means is a big, giant, ancient gorilla in this instance, whatever. And I mean, you could argue that it never would have been enough to make up for all of that at EOD, but at the end of the day, he could always say, like Ralph Abernathy once did, "At least I tried." Again, he didn't get that chance, or at least he didn't get the chance to expend himself to the point of saying that, yeah, there was most definitely nothing more that I could do. This is where the Japanese vets in -1, who are now private citizens, find themselves in the build up to the movie's climax. Again, they have been taught by the Japanese military that being Japanese means to never surrender under any circumstance. And yet that's exactly what their government did, after sacrificing countless lives needlessly in the process, no less. And this is why the absence of wokeness take baffles me, to the point I'm starting to believe that woke really just means colored to a lot of y'all. I swear this shit writes itself sometimes. I hate how a lot of modern amateur movie files can't seem to process the idea that a film can be and say more than one thing at the same time. -1, in addition to being a story of shared trauma, individual redemption, and kinda low-key a horror movie, and you could even argue a commentary on conservation, is more anti-war in its messaging than any Western blockbuster I can remember, since Hollywood basically mandated that every script with a budget over the price of a Happy Meal have some sort of war on terror rhetoric or propaganda baked into it way back in the mid-aughts. One of the primary supporting characters is, practically speaking, a personification of the Japanese people's frustration, distrust, and honestly disgust with their own government in the years immediately following the war. And it's not just the occupation that caused that, as we discussed earlier. It's an admittedly hokey scene, but the speech Nato gives the night before the movie's climax serves to articulate the thoughts of the men in the film who have gathered to hear it. They don't trust their government to do right by them, if they ever did, honestly, because if their time in the service has taught them anything, is that they are little more than cannon fodder to the people whose literal job is to protect their lives and their interests from harm. I think it's interesting that, unlike Shin Godzilla, which is an even more open critique of Japanese government, or at least the government as it currently operates, is that it's not a state-appointed task force that comes to the rescue in -1, but it's private citizens. And I think that it's important to make that distinction, because some folks, myself included, have pointed to the somewhat nationalistic tone that Shin Godzilla takes in its final act. One of the reasons I say that is the fact that it is ultimately the state that winds up solving the Godzilla problem, as though this was Anno's way of saying, this is what Japan is capable of when we're not being bogged down by bureaucracy and foreign influence. The outrage that the characters in Shin feel over the US's insistence on a nuclear solution feels as much like outrage over the potential loss of life as it does outrage over the perceived breach of sovereignty that imposition presents. Choosing the Yaguchi plan over the nuclear option feels as much like a middle finger to the US as it does a genuine attempt to preserve life. I don't get that with -1. The US is acknowledged only insofar as they say that, nah, y'all got it, bro. We got some more bombs to blow up in the ocean. At that point, the movie kind of dismisses the Americans the same way the Americans did their culpability in the monster's creation, no less. Once the monster has laid waste to Ginza, the people conclude that there is no Superman, or I guess super state in this instance, coming to save them. So instead, they take matters into their own hands, choosing to finish the fight, not to the death, but for the chance to live. That's the thing. This fight isn't for glory. It isn't for honor. It's not for any other warrior cult propaganda, but it's for life, human life. War had taught these characters something that both their own government and its American overseers failed to recognize, because they weren't the ones stabbing each other with bayoneted rifle barrels or watching their comrades fly kamikaze planes with no ejector seats to ensure that they had no choice but to make the ultimate sacrifice, or watch helplessly as blitz after blitz of American bombs rain down on their homes and claim the lives of their friends and family. That life, every life, has value and deserves to be lived to its fullest potential. That's the point I think -1 is ultimately trying to make, and it makes it pretty damn emphatically, if you ask me. Regardless of what the state, society, or even you may think, life, your life, is valuable, is precious, and most importantly, it's worth living, even if it's hard. Matter of fact, especially if it's hard, if for no other reason than to give yourself a chance at a brighter future. In summation, in my opinion, Shin Godzilla comes off as sort of a visual anthem, a rallying cry, if you will, for Japan and the Japanese people, while -1 feels a lot more like an anthem for humanity as a whole. We are strong, we are resilient, we can do damn near anything we put our collective minds to, not because we're Japanese, American, or anything else in between or around, but because we are human. The will to live and to live life on purpose, that propels us forward more than any sense of national identity, I think, is the ultimate message that I took from this movie. And if for no other reason, I think that makes this the wokest Godzilla movie that I've seen, at least. The things that we are capable of accomplishing when we learn to value each other as much as we do our own lives is practically limitless. That's what the climax and the build up to it suggests. Again, I don't want to give too much away, but when y'all watch it, if you haven't already, you'll understand what I'm saying. Again, without using any big scary phrases like socialism or class solidarity, oh my god, I think ultimately that's what we should take away from -1. A single human life is worth more than the wealth of an entire nation. And the day we figure that out is the day that humanity's potential becomes limitless.